Now, I know some of you just came to get the short answer about what is the best translation of the Septuagint without sitting through 20 minutes of explanation. Problem is, if I give you the answer right up front and you drop off, the algorithm will kill this video. So let's make a deal. This is a bit of an experiment on my part, but I'll give you my recommendations right up front. You hit the like button to keep this video, which has taken me a long time, loads of hours to produce, from getting crushed by the algorithm. Is that fair? Okay, so here are my quick recommendations. As a Greek instructor myself, this is what I would recommend. For beginners, I would recommend the Lexham English Septuagint, first edition, not the second. For scholars, I would recommend the NETS, that is N-E-T-S, the NETS edition. And I've got some warnings that come with these, but for those who don't want to spend a lot of money, I would recommend the Brenton translation. For devotional reading, I would recommend the Orthodox Study Bible with some important warnings, caveats with that one. Now, really, every single one of these have some real warnings. And before you spend your hard-earned cash, you need to be aware of the downsides of each one. And I especially want you to hear my warnings about the NETS and the Orthodox Study Bible before you buy either one of those. Now, at this point, a lot of people have already clicked off. But if you're still watching and you're one of the people actually digging deep into this, if you make it all the way to the end of the video, drop in the comments the words digging deep. I want to know who's still here at the end of this, and I'll give you a reward for sticking around. So here it is. There's a little known addition that doesn't change my main recommendations up above, but if I were personally stranded on a desert island and I could only take one Septuagint translation with me, this might be the one I grab. It's not from any of the major publishers, and you can actually get your hands on this incredible, I'm going to call it a jewel, a gem, for free. I'll show you exactly how you can do that if you stick to the end. And while I'm at it, I'm going to thank today's sponsor of this video. Yeah, I don't have any sponsor of this video, so this is for you. No one's given me any books to try to sell you, nothing like that. I just want to give you the information. Now, does it really matter what translation of the Septuagint you use? Well, let me ask you this. Does it matter to you if Methuselah lived past the flood? Well, it depends on which Septuagint translation you're going to read. And here, I want to kick off this discussion with a defense, really, of the Brenton translation. The Brenton translation was done in the 1800s, and a lot of people dismiss it as being old, pre-critical, before a lot of modern advances in textual criticism and things like this. You can hear criticism of Brenton. People say you don't need it anymore. Well, let me give you just one example why Brenton might not be so easy to throw away. I know that we've got all these other editions, but hear me out on the Brenton translation for just a moment. I looked at Genesis 5:25 as part of my studies here. Genesis 5:25 is interesting because if you read it in the Lexham edition, you read it in the NETS edition, and you work out the chronology, you'll have Methuselah living past the date of the flood. But not all Greek manuscripts of the Septuagint read that way. And Brenton, to his credit, was the only one that I could find. Even my Ralph's edition, which is just a full Greek edition, a semi-critical edition, didn't note the variant there. And it's by a notable manuscript, Codex Alexandrinus, which is a notable manuscript for the Septuagint, and Brenton is the one that brings it out. But let me hasten to add here, the Orthodox Study Bible actually follows the reading from Codex Alexandrinus here, which would make it that Methuselah doesn't live through the flood and alleviates this problem in the Septuagint. But I'm going to tell you that this is actually a bug and not a feature of the Orthodox Study Bible. It creates some interesting problems. It illustrates some interesting problems with the Orthodox Study Bible, and I'll explain that when we get there. Once you actually find out what's going on there, it might shock you. The other thing that I like about the Brenton translation is that the Brenton translation has the Greek text right beside it. So a lot of people are dismissing this one, but I think it's a very good translation. Now, here's why I didn't recommend it first for beginners. His language is antiquated, and if you find reading the King James Version difficult and that's a put off to you, and it is for a lot of people, you're not going to like the Brenton translation. It's not very up to date, but it does have a lot of very useful notes. It is true that there have been some advances in lexicography. There's updates and how people understand some things, but I think that case can be overstated. So if you're using the Brenton translation, you like the Brenton translation, I think that's excellent, and I wouldn't really discourage you too much from that, especially if you don't want to throw out some hard-earned cash on another edition. Now, I will mention that the Brenton translation is primarily derived from Codex Vaticanus. It even makes some helpful notes about some divergences from the authorized version. So it's an interesting edition, and I think people have what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery, because we think that something's newer, it's necessarily better. And I think that this Brenton translation still deserves our respect. Now, again, it's not my number one pick for beginners, because, again, beginners are going to be put off by the language. Now, toward the end of this video, if you want to see how this translation compares to others, I'm going to have a comparison of a verse so you can see how the Brenton translation compares to the Lexham and other translations. So let's move right on to my number one pick for beginners, and that's the Lexham English Septuagint. What I like about this is it's a very literal rendering of the Greek. It started out, a group of scholars, good scholars, did an interlinear translation of the Septuagint. That's kind of a word-for-word translation. So the Lexham English Septuagint is a very literal rendering. Now, I've done a lot of YouTube videos, and I personally like to work directly from the Greek text, but a lot of people don't have the benefit of having studied Greek and totally understand that. And so often when I'm doing YouTube videos, I need a translation of the Septuagint that's ready to go. And there were times I would compare the first edition to the second edition, and I found that I appreciated the first edition more. And as I began to dig into this more for research for this video, I want to give you some reasons, some differences between the first and the second edition. It is true that the second edition has smoothed some things out, and it's brought in some consistency. There were multiple translators that worked, and sometimes one translator would prefer one word over a different word in terms of how they're going to translate a particular Greek word. And so the second edition sort of smoothed that out. But I still found some of the things that they eliminated in the second edition, I think they shouldn't have eliminated them. For example, the first edition has some very helpful footnotes, and I'll give you a specific example here in 1 Samuel 17:4. It's a very notable one where Goliath, in the Masoretic text, they tell us that he was 6 cubits in a span. That would put him at about 9'9", something like that. And the Septuagint text has 4 cubits in a span, which would put him much shorter, maybe around 6'8", 6'9", something like that. The second edition of the Lexham English Septuagint eliminates the helpful footnote that tells you that 4Q, Samuel, which is from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Josephus agree with the Septuagint reading. And there's nothing that alerts you, as far as a footnote, that there's some disagreement between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. Now, I take it for granted, if you're a beginner, you're going to be interested, unless you're, someone who's grown up with the Septuagint, you're going to be interested in where the Septuagint and the Hebrew text disagree. And so a lot of those notes have been removed in the second edition. Also in the second edition, they've done some things differently about how they're going to translate the text. And on the surface of it, it seems kind of neat. It's kind of a novel idea. So, as you may know, the Septuagint, which translated the Hebrew Bible, was translated over a period of time by different translators. And the second edition of the Lexham English Septuagint actually tries to mimic the style that's reflected in the translation philosophy of the individual translator of various books. So let's give an example. So let's say in Genesis, the Septuagint translator is translating very literally and sticking word for word. Well, when they translate, the second edition tries to translate Genesis, it does the same thing. It tries to mimic that style of translation, very word for word style. But then in another book where the Septuagint translator gets more idiomatic, takes more freedoms, the Lexham edition tries to mimic that. Well, then, to me, that's not an improvement because I'm wanting to get as close to the original wording of the Septuagint rather than having someone mimic the style of the Septuagint translator by throwing in all sorts of idiomatic English phrases which might not represent the Greek phrases. And I know that might be a little complicated, but I think that the first edition, as I've compared translations and I've looked at it, I find that it has more helpful footnotes, will sometimes tell you when something is being translated more idiomatically. To me, it's just a more helpful translation than the second edition. Now, here's the problem. If you're not using Logos Bible software, it's hard to get your hands probably on that first edition. And so maybe the only thing, if you're going to get a printed copy, is the second edition. So my preference would be the Lexham first edition over the second edition. Second edition is fine if it's all you can get your hands on. It's a good translation as well, but it lacks some of the good features of the first edition, like we just mentioned with the footnote about Goliath, and those sorts of things appear over and over again. Speaking of Goliath, that's a good way to segue into our third point about, or our third translation, which is the NETS, the New English Translation of the Septuagint. This is one that's for scholars, but let me give you a warning. It's not for everybody, and I think it has some real downsides. It would not be my personal first choice, but it might be a good first choice for someone who's, writing academic papers and they want to quote from authoritative translation of the Septuagint. They have other academic peers that are looking at it. But since we were talking about Goliath, let me give you an example of why I don't think the NETS is the best for everybody. So 1 Samuel 17:4, I'll read it to you from the NETS. And a mighty man came out from the ranks of the Allophiles. Goliath was his name. I want to ask you, what is Allophiles? What does that mean to you? Probably nothing, right? And what they've done is they've transliterated a word in the Greek, which means something like someone from another tribe or an alien, someone that's not part of your kin group, something like that. And they've just transliterated it, but they've made it completely unintelligible. And this word is often used in the Septuagint when the writer is translating, for Philistine. And it just, to me, it just makes it confusing. And this shows up all over the NETs. So one of the advantages of the first edition of the Lexham is that they translate the words like we're used to seeing them, but will also give you a footnote about how you would transliterate it if you're transliterating it from Greek. So I think the NETs makes unnecessarily difficult to read. Now, it is a pretty good literal rendering. Now, I would say another downside to this is it actually starts with the NRSV. And instead of starting with a fresh translation of the Septuagint on its own terms, it starts with the NRSV, which is based on the Hebrew text. In other words, the NETS doesn't simply translate the Septuagint as a Greek document. It translates it as like almost a Hebrew-Greek hybrid, letting the Hebrew heavily influence how it renders the Greek. This approach can be valuable for some sort of scholarly comparison, but for devotional reading or ordinary study, I just think it's more difficult than it needs to be. And I'm not a real big fan of the NRSV anyways, and so this one isn't my favorite. Now, I told you that there's some warnings about the Orthodox Study Bible. This is the fourth translation we're going to look at. And on the surface, I really like the Orthodox Study Bible. I like having the Septuagint and the New Testament all in one volume, and it's really great for that. But just like the NETS edition, I'm going to call it the OSB from now, the Orthodox Study Bible, the OSB does the same thing and basically starts from the Masoretic Hebrew text because they base their translation on the NKJV. And this, you might not think that is a big deal because they're adjusting it to the Septuagint, but I haven't deeply used the OSB, but just in very quickly starting to look for, differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint. It didn't take me long. I mean, just in Genesis 4:5, and here's a warning about this. So if you're Orthodox, I want you to be aware of this, like Orthodox with a capital O, and you like this as a devotional Bible, just be aware that they started with the Hebrew text, and this led to some blunders. Let me give you an example. Genesis 4:8. 8. I'm going to read it from the Lexham edition. And yet Cain said to Abel his brother, "Let us go through to the field." Now, that phrase, "let us go into the field," or however you want to render that, is present in the Septuagint. And the Orthodox Study Bible, in their introduction, made it clear that they were following the Ralph's edition. When they were updating the NKJV, the Ralph's edition has that phrase, "Let us go to the field. Let us go out to the field." This has been missed. And I think the reason they missed it is because they started with the Hebrew text. And by the way, this is supported by other ancient versions. It's a significant variant from the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. And so it's interesting. Remember how I was telling you it depended on which edition of the Septuagint as to whether, Methuselah died, before the flood or if he lived through the flood. Well, the Orthodox Study Bible reads just like the Masoretic text, which does read just like Codex Alexandrinus. The problem is they're saying they're following the Ralph's edition, and the Ralph's edition does not read that way, and they give you no footnote to alert you that this has happened. Again, what I suspect here is that they have blundered and just followed the Masoretic text. And so the fact that they get it right about Methuselah seems to me to be an accident rather than the fact that they are correctly trying to render the Septuagint. The other warning I would give you about the Orthodox Study Bible is from a person who is not coming from a capital O Orthodox perspective. I'm not Eastern Orthodox. I'm not Oriental Orthodox or anything like that. The notes and the introductions are radically different from what I believe to be the truth on a number of subjects. Now, if you're Orthodox and you come from that perspective, you're going to like the study notes, but from my perspective, I don't think those study notes are helpful, but you can always just ignore those if you'd like to have an edition of the Septuagint and the New Testament combined. Now, what they do say at the beginning, to their credit, is they're not saying, hey, this is a better translation than anything that's out there. I think the main feature of this is that it's a Septuagint and a New Testament combined, and that's hard to find these days. So it does have that advantage. Now, I'll just throw out an honorable mention here, and there is Thompson's translation of the Septuagint, and it was done in the 1800s as well. It's not as well known, but it's a very careful, literal translation, and I think if somebody's using it, that's fantastic. It's kind of hard to get your hands on now. I think you could probably find it in the public domain out there, so Thompson's is good, but it's going to have the same drawback as Brenton's. It's a little difficult for modern readers to read. The language is a little dated, but it's something at least to consider. Okay, well, let's stop at this point in the video, and let's do a comparison between these various different texts. Now, I'm going to encourage you to pause the video so you can see this comparison. Now, I provided my very literal translation of the Greek here, and you can compare it to how others have handled this. And this video is already getting quite long, so I'll let you just pause that and you can look at that. But stay with me, because now let's talk about that desert. I'm going to call it the desert island pick. Okay, if I were headed to a desert island and I could only take one Septuagint translation with me, I might actually pick the one that hardly anybody talks about anymore, and that's the Apostolic Bible Polyglot. This isn't published by any academic publisher, and it's really interesting. And I think if you're into serious study of the Septuagint and you're not just looking for a smooth translation, you might consider this. It's actually an interlinear translation. It includes the Septuagint text. It has Protestant canon, but that might be a put off to some of you who have an expanded canon. It is keyed to Strong's numbers, so you have the Strong's number. And what I think is just remarkable about it is it has this built-in concordance at the back, so that you can see how a Greek word is used not only in the Septuagint, but also into the New Testament, which I think is really phenomenal. Now, what I told you is that you can get this edition completely for free, and I think that's just great. And what I'm going to do as a reward for you, in the comment section, I have put, for those who dig deeper, and then there's a link right there in there. It's kind of buried in the description there, kind of hidden for those of you who really do love digging deep into these. And by the way, if you've made it this far in the video, type in the comments, digging deep. And if you're interested in the differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text, I'm going to encourage you to watch this video next.